Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. This is episode 159, A Sea Highwayman. Immediately before the arrival of European colonists in the form of the Pilgrims, the Patuxet Indian tribe lived on Massachusetts Bay, very near where Plymouth would eventually be founded. The Patuxet belonged to the Wampanoag Confederation, a coalition of tribes that largely spoke the Massachusetts language, a subgroup of the Greater Algonquin language family. You can see why I want to try to avoid too much of this. It gets complex, and I'm just leagues from qualified to talk about any of this stuff, but the Patuxet are worth a special note. The Wampanoag coalition was formed to counter incursions from the Iroquois Confederation. If I had the expertise, the Iroquois Confederation is something really worth talking about. It was a relatively new coalition of Mohawk and Huron and Cree peoples, among others, and the Iroquois were something of an existential threat to the Algonquins, especially in the Northeast. I have an analogy that I really don't like to use, mostly because it makes me admit things about myself I'd care not to, but it fits. In Star Wars, in the old extended universe canon, in the old Star Wars novels, there was an invasion from another galaxy that very nearly destroyed the New Republic. They had, in their armada, sentient planets that could cause untold devastation. Emperor Palpatine, who was dead by that point, could see the future, and he forged his galaxy into a unified empire that built, planet-killing weapons. The theory is that Palpatine intended to defend against this imminent existential threat. And in the late 1500s, in the real world, the Iroquois forged a confederation shortly after first coming into contact with European colonists. And I don't know this to be certain, but it's almost as if they were trying to forge their world into a unified force to resist the threat that was coming. Now, they probably would have failed anyway. The disease and technological disparities would have seen to that, but it would have given them a better fighting chance. But the Wampanoag Confederation, much like the plucky rebels in Star Wars, fought them. And by 1610, the war between these two confederations was contentious and raging. Now, most of the warriors that belonged to the Patuxet people were stationed on the front lines. And I should note a couple of things here. The Mohawk people in the Iroquois Confederation were not the same people as the Mohican people. The Mohican people fought on the Wampanoag side of the coalition against the Mohawk. In fact, most of the Patuxet warriors were fighting on the border between the Mohawk and Mohican peoples. This was a major conflict, and it would continue on for decades and decades, and it's going to form the backdrop for much of our story, at least that takes place in North America. But on that same note, we also shouldn't confuse the Patuxet people with the Patuxent people down near Jamestown. They are different peoples, but that was a common misconception at the time, largely due to the confusion of one man, John Smith. The same John Smith that founded, or helped found, Jamestown and Virginia. He was among the first Europeans to make contact with the Patuxent and Patuxet peoples, and he believed them to be either the same people or at least very closely related. On that voyage, on which John Smith met the Patuxet people in the Northeast, he coined the name New England. Now, he originally intended this to include Virginia and all of England's colonies in America, as we discussed last time, but that didn't catch on, except in, of course, what we call New England today. Now, John Smith, after his initial voyage, left the region intending to come back and establish a colony very near those friendly Patuxet people. And he did so, but when he returned to America, every last Patuxet person in America was already dead. In fact, there was only one member of that tribe still alive. See, after John Smith left the New England region, one of his rivals attacked the Patuxet and captured several of them to sell back in Europe. But these Native Americans were sold, mostly in Spain in this case, to serve as a sort of curio, living exhibits of American savages that could be bedecked and tattooed in the wildest fashions imaginable and paraded around all the courts of Europe. And while they were slaves, it was more like the ancient Roman system. They were allowed to craft and sell their own wares, to accept tips for performance, and eventually to buy their own freedom. One of those Patuxet natives sold into slavery was a young man named Tisquantum, who we would know better as Squanto. Squanto earned his freedom after a few years of slavery and sailed for England, and then in 1619 he booked passage back to America. But when he arrived back home, he found his entire village empty. Everyone was dead. But it wasn't warfare. It was a plague. It was probably smallpox, although there are other theories what it might have been, and it probably came from John Smith's expedition. And it swept through the Northeast, but hit the Wampanoag coalition especially hard, and the Patuxet people, except for Squanto, were entirely wiped out. Just about a year later, the Pilgrims made their first landing at what would come to be called Provincetown, at the tip of Cape Cod. And then they sailed over to where these friendly Patuxet people were supposed to be located. Thanks to John Smith, they had pretty decent maps of the region, but of course they found their village abandoned. That village, on the western coast of Cape Cod Bay, became the site of their settlement at Plymouth. And, by the way, Cape Cod Bay is one of the English colonies we mentioned last time in the running to be dubbed the most important piratical location in North America, alongside Carolina. And when the closest tribe to this newly founded settlement realized that there were a bunch of English people living over there, they decided to send an emissary, and there was only one real candidate. Squanto spoke both their own Massachusetts language and English fluently, and he knew the English people. And that story is obviously amazing. You know, it's fraught with peril and backstabbing and double dealings, and not all of it on the part of the English. The story is a ton of fun, but it would take an entire episode just to scratch the surface of. Suffice it to say, though, Squanto was, at these early stages, at the heart of everything, and he played both sides against the middle to benefit himself a lot of times. There was tension at first, and it almost broke into open fighting, but Squanto negotiated the sale of that land to the Pilgrims and eventually an alliance, a trade alliance at first. And all of that drama culminates in Thanksgiving, the feast at which they celebrated their new alliance. And then, for a few years, all appeared to be well, until we catch up to where we left off, with the arrival of the Massachusetts Bay colonists and their settlements in, primarily at first, Boston and Salem. The Great Migration of 20,000 colonists into the Massachusetts Bay Colony destabilized all of the politics in the region, and it overshadowed not only the Native Americans but every other colonial venture in North America, including even New Netherland and Quebec. In eastern North America, Mexico City and, if you included Havana, are pretty big deals, but if we exclude the Spanish, Massachusetts is it. To understand what's to come, we should talk a little bit about the geography of the region and introduce a couple of Native American peoples. Take a look at a map of New England, and I'll throw up some relevant maps on the website, both of colonial boundaries at the time and of the modern state boundaries. But we're going to be using those state boundaries to discuss regions. We'll understand it better that way. You've got Cape Cod, that pirate hook hanging off the side of America, which is of course the home to the Pilgrims in Plymouth. And then if you look at the rest of Massachusetts, that is roughly analogous to what the Massachusetts Bay Colony effectively controlled at the time. But then to the west of Cape Cod and to the south of mainland Massachusetts, you have what is today Rhode Island, but at the time was the home of the Narragansett people, who, live on Narragansett Bay. And immediately to the west of modern Rhode Island, we have the state or the territory of Connecticut. Now, at the time, Connecticut didn't exist in any political sense whatsoever, but it was home to two tribes who are very closely related to the Mohican people. This is what I was trying to avoid, but I can't see any good way around it, so I'm going to jump in. The Mohican people lived along the Hudson River, up near Fort Orange, or modern-day Albany, in what was at the time New Netherland. And then a splinter group of the Mohican people traveled down the Hudson River and migrated over into modern-day Connecticut, on the coast of Long Island Sound. Now, we know those people as the Pico people, but that may or may not have been what they were called at the time. They might have just called themselves the Mohican. But you see, that group, the Pico, split once again into two smaller groups, one called the Pico and the other called the Mohegan, who are not the Mohican people, but very closely related. So up near Albany on the Hudson River, the Mohican people. Down to the south, you have the Pico people, and to the west of the Pico, you have the Mohegan people. The first thing you may notice is that they lived in between the English colonies on Massachusetts Bay and the Dutch colony in New Netherland. And that's a dangerous place to find yourself when your new gun-toting neighbors have expansion on their mind. Now, at first, the Massachusetts Bay colony was on good terms with all of them, but it soon became clear that if they intended to continue expanding, and they did, they would have to expand into Native American territory that they weren't willing to sell. And among those three peoples there was one very obvious target. The Pico people were enemies of the Mohican people from whom they had split. They were enemies of the Mohegan people who had split from them. They were enemies of the Narragansett and the entire Wampanoag coalition. And in fact, the only people that they were not enemies of in the region were the Massachusetts Bay colony. And then one of them killed a Massachusetts colonist. This act was decried at every pulpit and by every pastor in Massachusetts. The people were up in arms about this murder, and their governor, Henry Vane, roused a militia. And as a side note, I would love to tell you that there was any kind of connection between Henry Vane and Charles Vane. And it's not necessarily 100% out of the realm of possibility that Henry Vane's son slept with a chambermaid or a tavern wench who gave birth to an illegitimate son that would go on to be Charles Vane, infamous pirate. Now, that didn't happen, but if you want to pretend it did in your own headcanon, who am I to stop you? But Henry Vane roused that militia and embarked on a war called the Pico War, which was a brutal affair. Now, the Pico people did have a few initial successes, mostly in raids against their tribal enemies, but as soon as the English got really involved, they just massacred them. Sometimes in fair battles, as fair as a battle between bows and muskets can be, but sometimes the English just massacred them in good old-fashioned exterminations. On one occasion, during a religious festival in which the women and children were the target. Now, during the Pico War, a new governor was elected, a man named John Winthrop the Elder. But it's his son, John Winthrop the Younger, who really concerns us at first. The younger Winthrop went on to establish the first of the New England colonies to break away from Massachusetts. Some of the colonies we're going to mention today were established over legitimate differences in theological or legal ideology, and we'll get to those. But this first colony, the Saybrook colony, founded by the governor's son, well, while it looked like it was founded under legitimate differences of opinion, I don't think that's the case. In 1635, John Winthrop the Younger traveled down the Connecticut River to her outlet in the Long Island Sound, right in the middle of lands that belonged to the Pico people. and he began construction of an honestly impressive fort, Fort Saybrook. This fort would prove to be invaluable in the Pico War that was to come, and it may be why he chose that location, but it's not why he built it in the first place. See, at this moment, back in England, there was this relatively little-known fringe Puritan parliamentarian who was in hot water with the king. He was named, Oliver Cromwell. Now, John Winthrop the Younger was a devotee of Oliver Cromwell, and he established Saybrook, both the colony and the fort, to welcome Cromwell to America. It was to be Cromwell's home. But as it turned out, Cromwell didn't flee to America. By the end of the war, the Pico people, what remained of them, fled into the Iroquois Confederation to live among the Mohawk people. Which means, well, would you look at that? Just a bunch of land sitting there, all empty. Now, it's not the best land, agriculturally speaking, but the land along Long Island Sound was tactically valuable. It had good outlets to the sea and threatened the territory of Dutch New Netherland. However, Saybrook wasn't going to last. There is no state of Saybrook these days, but there are 2 modern-day states in the U.S. that were founded here in the 1630s based upon those ideological differences I mentioned. Now, last time we pointed at some of the differences in the kind of Puritans that colonized Plymouth and Massachusetts, the witch burners versus the freedom of religion Puritans, but we ignored the most important differences. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in order to vote, and they did vote, but in order to do so, you had to be white and you had to be male. That goes without saying. You also had to own land, though, and, that's not unheard of. It's despicable, yeah, but it was really the norm until the French Revolution, and even the later radical parts of the French Revolution. But what sets Massachusetts apart, especially in their voting, was their religious purity test. John Winthrop the Elder, in fact all of the senior leadership in Massachusetts, were really, really Puritan. And we would expect them to require their voting populace to be Puritan as well, and they did. But being Puritan only got you through the door. See, they were also rich and influential Puritans, and they were unwilling to risk that. So you had to be Puritan, but you also had to swear the requisite oaths not to undermine either the Anglican Church or the king. And make no mistake, the Massachusetts government did not like the king or the church, but they weren't here for a revolution. They were here to make money and to establish a secure and long-lasting colony that would be friendly to future Puritans. And that means following the rules, following the letter of the law, not making any waves that may get their charter revoked. But that purity test led to a series of divisions among people in Massachusetts. People who did not subscribe to the doctrine of the church in Boston. The next colony to separate from Massachusetts control was founded by one of my favorite early Americans, Roger Williams. Now, he was a Puritan minister, but the kind of Puritan I can get behind, at least a bit. He was a staunch advocate for the separation of church and state, as well as the freedom of religion and the abolition of slavery. Beyond that, he was very well educated. He spoke English and French and Dutch and Latin and Greek and I think Hebrew, and he wrote the very first book on the Narragansett language. Williams was also an advocate for what he called liberty of conscience, what the Church Fathers in Boston called new and dangerous ideas. In particular, that liberty of conscience meant that Williams believed that the Puritan faith should be separated from the Church of England. Also, in his view, King Charles was, at this point, in dereliction of duty and liable to be removed. Now, these were dangerous ideas that the Fathers in Boston could not accept, although they would become standard ideas in less than 5 years or so. But at the time, they were revolutionary, and John Winthrop the Elder didn't like them. Roger Williams also argued, notably, that Massachusetts' policies toward the Native American peoples, namely stealing their land and failing to pay them a fair price, were immoral. They were sinful and unacceptable. John Winthrop the Elder really didn't like that. The government of Massachusetts attempted to seize Roger Williams and deport him back to England, but Williams gave them the slip. It was the middle of winter and quite snowy, but Williams marched over 50 miles to a Narragansett village where he took shelter, and Williams negotiated a fair and equitable purchase of what would prove to be one of my favorite colonies, Rhode Island. Small, stubborn, contrarian, principled, I identify with Rhode Island. However, to be accurate, Roger Williams did not found Rhode Island. He founded a colony called the Providence Plantations at what would become Providence, Rhode Island. Other, later, also pretty crazy settlers would establish a colony on the actual island that was called Rhode Island at the time, and the capital there called Newport. Newport is another one of those locales like Cape Cod and Carolina that will become extremely important to our story of pirates. And I wanted to get to all of those locations today, but I don't think I'm going to. I realize that I haven't talked much about Boston and Massachusetts proper, and I haven't even mentioned New Haven and Connecticut. We're going to put that off until next time, I think. Really, they're going to become a lot more relevant in our story next time. And I want to tell another story today. I want to shift focus to Maine and the first New England pirate, Dixie Bull. Dixie Bull is a reasonable example of a typical New England colonist. You know, we often hear the stories of the Pilgrims or the Puritan leadership in New England, but they aren't really representative of the average colonists. Those draconian purity tests in Massachusetts were intended to keep most of the people from voting. But Dixie Bull, at least until he turned to piracy, is very representative of a more average sort of colonist. His story begins in England, and really it begins with a war hero named Sir Ferdinando Jorge. And I assure you, Ferdinando Jorge is English. He was a nobleman in Plymouth and commanded an infantry regiment in the Anglo-Spanish War back in 1588 at the time of the Spanish Armada. In the years following the war, he became interested in North American colonization and invested, in a minor fashion, in a few of the colonies we've talked about so far. Dixie Bull, though, was born in Plymouth as well, and he was apprenticed as a skinner to his brother named Seth Bull. Once that initial apprenticeship was up, Dixie Bull indentured himself. He sold himself into indentured servitude to the Worshipful Company of Skinners. The Worshipful Company of Skinners was a grandiose name for a merchant company based in London but with a chapter house in Plymouth that traded in fur and skin and leathers, hence Skinner. Professionally, Dixie Bull was a fur trader, which was a relatively modest profession. That is, until the American fur trade showed up and proved to be very lucrative. Beaver pelts were making some people very rich. That's why Dixie Bull indentured himself. The Worshipful Company of Skinners had the ability to get him to America. They sold him to Sir Ferdinando Jorge, who was planning an expedition to the New World to establish a fur trading operation. Sir Ferdinando and the governor of English Newfoundland acquired a patent to establish the province of Maine. Their patent, from the Council of New England, would establish the province of Maine as part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It would be at least under the governor's discretion. They sent an agent of theirs named Christopher Leavitt to establish a town called Falmouth, which actually isn't the location of modern-day Falmouth. It's closer to where Portland, Maine is today. But that initial colony failed. However, Leavitt would go on to try again, granted land that would eventually become New Hampshire. Again, we'll talk about that next time. For now, we need to talk about the other major settlements in Maine, the relevant settlements in Maine. In 1628, they established a fur trading post on the site of modern-day Bristol called Pemaquid. That same year, the English captured the oldest permanent settlement in New England, a French fortification called Fort Pentagouet. Those two locations, Pemaquid and Fort Pentagouet, served as the center of the beaver pelt operation in North America for the time being. By 1632, Dixie Bull was the captain of his own bark that sailed between Pemaquid and Fort Pentagouet and Boston and even back to Plymouth in England, and he traded almost exclusively in beaver pelts. Now, he was still indentured to Sir Ferdinando, but he was making a reasonable living, on track to buy his way out of his servitude. And in June of 1632, Dixie Bull was at Fort Pentagouet, with a haul full of beaver pelts that he intended to sell in Boston, and it was right then that a French fleet arrived and attacked. Now, the problem with the story of Dixie Bull is a lack of good primary sources. He wasn't the sort of man to keep a diary, for example, so we don't know much about his motivations or, indeed, much about his actions, but we do have some colonial records and even a number of older secondary sources. There's two of note here. George Francis Dow's 1923 work, The Pirates of the New England Coast, and Edward Rowe Snow's 1944 history, Pirates and Buccaneers of the Atlantic Coast. There are other, less reputable sources which we're going to exclude that all just seem to sort of plagiarize the colonial sources and those two works. But from those very few scant sources, we have a rough outline from which to work. That French attack in June of 1632 captured all of Dixie Bull's cargo, all of his beaver pelts. However, they didn't capture his ship. So Dixie Bull sailed to Boston, where, according to John Winthrop the Elder, he recruited, quote, 15 more who kept about the east, end quote. That is to say, Cape Cod men, who, at least in Winthrop's view, were a disreputable sort of character. And with 15 additional men added to his crew, Dixie Bull, well, we don't know why he did what he did here. We know that he was out a great deal of money, perhaps even enough to buy his freedom. But I'll give two separate accounts. Edward Snow writes, quote, "Without question, Dixie Bull tried manfully to get revenge on the French pirates who had descended on both the Pilgrim trading post and his own little chaloupe." End quote. Okay, I love this book. It was written in that sweet spot in mid-century America where the language is modern enough to understand. I mean, he did write manfully with a straight face, but it is easy to comprehend. But before publishers began asking those pesky questions like, did you just make that up? But everything that he says here is wrong. First of all, Snow describes a raid on a trading post by a bunch of French pirates attacking a band of pilgrims. Prior to that, he had told this fanciful story about the French pirates affecting a Scottish accent and telling these pilgrims that they were lost. They were then invited ashore to capture their trading post, which was only guarded by 4 men, despite having rooms chock full of guns. It's a fine story, but it's not corroborated anywhere else. And then, as you could tell by my sarcastic tone, he gets basically all the facts wrong. That Pilgrim trading post was a former French fort that was captured by not pilgrims, but English fur traders. So we shouldn't trust him at all, but I'm going to continue to refer to him when it pleases me. But more shocking than any of those other complete fabrications is that he says Dixie Bull tried to get revenge on the French without question. And there are a ton of questions about whether or not Dixie Bull in fact tried to get revenge on the French. George Francis Dow in The Pirates of the New England Coast writes, quote, Bull sailed along the coast in the late summer, hoping to fall in with some Frenchmen and retrieve his losses. But the French kept out of sight and, badly in need of supplies, Bull took and plundered 2 or 3 small vessels owned by English colonial traders, and from them forced 4 or 5 men to join his company." End quote. They both claim that Dixie Bull intended to recoup his losses from the French, but he never attacked a single French ship. Instead, he attacked exclusively the English. And all of the authors who write about Dixie Bull, from George Francis Dow to Edward Snow to those less reputable writers, they all have their own Francophobic, Anglophile, maybe kind of racist explanations for why he did what he did. He was going hungry, maybe, or maybe he was duped by the Scottish accent, or maybe he wasn't really in command at all. Maybe this good, God-fearing Englishman was actually captured by the French pirates and used as a patsy to take the blame. They all have explanations, but none of them really know. The governor of Massachusetts himself didn't know. The victims who suffered the attentions of Dixie Bull didn't know. Nobody knows why Dixie Bull did what he did. But everybody knows that his next act of piracy would forever stain him as Edward Snow says so beautifully, a sea highwayman. Dixie Bull sailed on Pemaquid, the other settlement in Maine, the actual fur trading post, a location where he was well known. He went ashore without anybody questioning him. But then his crew of pirates pulled their weapons and held the town hostage. They loaded their ship up with furs and food and drink and even a small bit of silver that they found. Exactly how much they found is disputed, but if we take the middle path and the most commonly quoted amount, it's about 500 pounds sterling. The inhabitants, all throughout this event, were shocked. These men, stealing from them, holding them at gunpoint, were Englishmen. Then, with their ship filled to the brim, Dixie Bull and his men got on board and prepared to leave. Pirates and Buccaneers of the Atlantic coast says, quote, "The stunned defenders sent a parting volley out toward the pirate ship just as the ruffians weighed anchor to sail off with their booty." End quote. But that parting shot, we can actually verify this, it struck and killed the first mate of Dixie Bull's ship. And this death, well, it appalled the pirates on board. Most of them weren't really pirates, just ruffians. Most of them had never seen any form of combat before, and some of them had never seen anyone die. We can verify that story, though, because a few days later, Dixie Bull captured another ship, another English ship. A merchant in this case who, when Dixie Bull was done with him, sailed on to Boston. That merchant brought all the news of Bull's piracy to the governor's attention, and he told the people of Boston that these pirates were in shock at having seen one of their number die. Now that merchant says that Dixie Bull and his men didn't steal anything from him. What they were after was a pilot, someone that could guide them down to Virginia, a colony that, according to George Dow, was, quote, "a nest of rogues, whores, dissolute and rooking persons," end quote. However, no one on board that merchant ship knew the way to Virginia, or at least they convinced the pirates they didn't. And that's the end of what we can reliably say about Dixie Bull. Now, a ton of myths and legends grew up around him. There were ballads and odes written to this nefarious pirate, to this dread New England pirate. There were at least 3 locations where, reportedly, Dixie Bull buried his treasure. And the amount of treasure reportedly buried was, well, it was logistically impossible. He didn't steal enough treasure to equal that amount. Not nearly enough silver. There probably wasn't enough silver in all of New England to match those reports, and frankly, I don't think beaver pelts do that well when buried offshore. Naturally, none of them have ever been found. And rumors of Dixie Bull persisted for many years. He appeared in Virginia, Carolina, even the Caribbean. But Captain Roger Clapp, who was the leader of a flotilla sent to apprehend Dixie Bill immediately after his raid on Pemaquet, said that, quote, "Bull got to England, but God destroyed this wretched man," end quote. And Edward Snow writes that Bull was either executed or met a violent end upon reaching England, end quote. George Francis Dow and all of those other less reputable writers all agree with this sentiment. Yes, Dixie Bull made it back to England, but was immediately killed for his sins. And that's how pirate stories are supposed to end, right? The evildoers always lose in the end, and the good guys win. There are only a very few occasions where this isn't the case, and they are notable. Some of those are my favorite stories. But the truth of Dixie Bull is that he is also one of those exceptions. Now, we don't know when Bull returned to England, and we don't know how or by what route he returned to England, but we do know that he made it home. However, there's no record of his death. Quite the contrary, in fact. A few years later, Dixie Bull pops up in the records of none other than the Worshipful Company of Skinners. Dixie Bull, nefarious pirate, paid off his indenture, probably with the booty from his raid on Pemaquid, and was thusly admitted into the Worshipful Company, himself a fellow Skinner. Last time we talked about the expansion of colonial New England and the first New England pirate, Dixie Bull. Today we're continuing on in that vein, but we're going to blast past a lot of this early American history and some of the very early American pirates. See, there's a lot of pirates operating off the Atlantic coast, just as there are in the West Indies during this first half of the 17th century. But we run into the same problems in New England that we did in the West Indies. We don't have an Alexander Exquemelin or a William Dampier that realized the value of these stories. And, not the cultural value, it's not literature we're talking about. It's the monetary value, the cold hard cash that was to be earned by publishing their tales. Most of the sources we have are usually kind of dry. Council minutes and trial records, which means that, unfortunately, many of the stories we have about those early American pirates are kind of dull. They might nab a haul of fur or fish or tobacco, and that's great. I fully support them in their thievery, but it's not exciting. And these very early American pirates don't necessarily share the culture of the latter pirates. They don't have pirate codes or even sometimes their shipboard democracy. Most of that came from Barbary and the Sally Rovers or the Brethren of the Coast. And it's that culture, that anarchic, anti-establishment culture that threatened to bring the great empires of the world to their knees, right? So, insofar as I am able, to get back to that era of empire-shaking piracy, I'm going to truncate this story. The bullet point version of early American piracy. This is episode 160, Wicked and Unrighteous Practices. I'd like to introduce an English nobleman who really has been behind everything that we've been talking about here in New England. His name was Robert Rich, one of a very long line of barons named Robert Rich, but he was also an earl, the second Earl of Warwick. In his book, The Pirates' Pact, Douglas Burgess calls the Earl of Warwick, quote, a sort of pirate broker-in-chief, end quote. And he was, but he was much more than that. Warwick was a Puritan and a parliamentarian, and at one point in his career, the Lord High Admiral. And we'll get to his piratical connections shortly, but first let's look at his colonial connections. That will help refresh us on everything we've talked about thus far. Warwick was the president of the Providence Company, the company that attempted to found a Puritan colony on Providence Island off the Mosquito Coast. And he was the president, for a time, of the New England Company, His fingers are in all of these pies here in New England and really across most of the English colonies in the world. Now, he wasn't responsible for the Plymouth colony or the Pilgrims, but the Earl of Warwick was behind the Massachusetts Bay colony. There were others involved as well, but he was right at the top. Shortly thereafter, he secured patents for the Providence plantation and the Rhode Island colony at Newport. As well, he secured the patent for the Saybrook colony, founded by John Winthrop the Younger. And I gave Saybrook short shrift last time, which was unfair. Were I not attempting to truncate today's episode, I would go into greater depth there. But even though it was founded as a haven for Oliver Cromwell, it proved to be a valuable fort in the conflicts to come, and helped to establish the colony of Connecticut. But Warwick was involved in everything: Maine, Connecticut, New Hampshire. But in New Hampshire, actually, he wasn't involved as a proponent. Instead, he was an opponent to the New Hampshire colony. Remember those two men who founded the province of Maine, Ferdinando Jorge and John Mason? Well, there was a legal settlement involving both of those men, as well as the Earl of Warwick and the governor of Massachusetts, that split the territory in Maine between Jorge and Mason. John Mason was allocated the land to the southwest of the split, which he would go on to name New Hampshire. It was an independent colony, not a province of Massachusetts. Now, New Hampshire's story is rife with territorial disputes. There were disputes with Massachusetts and Quebec, but more interesting to me, and pertinent to our story, are their disputes with New Netherland concerning the Connecticut River. Now, the Connecticut River was intended to be the border of New Hampshire, which is today their modern boundary, but Mason and the later New Hampshire colonists extended beyond that river into what was officially Dutch territory. The land into which they moved would eventually become Vermont, although that is a long time in the future. But that dispute caused some friction between the English and the Dutch. However, it was nothing compared to what was occurring down south. You'll recall that the Pico War in the 1630s left this vast stretch of land to the west of Fort Saybrook on Long Island Sound, a swath of land that had belonged to the Pico people, but now looked very much like free real estate. However, the Pico people had been allied to the Dutch, and this stretch of land, unlike New Hampshire, was really, really close to New Amsterdam, and the English moved in and founded New Haven. This led to more than simple friction. It led to border clashes and minor conflicts that very nearly turned into open warfare. But global politics interrupted everything. See, this flurry of colonization took place in the 1620s and 1630s. But in the 1630s, the Dutch had much larger concerns than a fur trading outpost in America. There had been, by this point, about 3 decades of Dutch encroachment on Portuguese and Spanish territory, on their trade routes, their spice monopolies, and even their slave markets. And remember that the Dutch were still technically part of the Spanish Empire. The Dutch revolt, coinciding with the Anglo-Spanish War, had allowed them to put to sea in the first place, but all of this encroachment on Spanish interest was illegal, at least in the eyes of the Spanish. So right when the English are moving in on Dutch New Netherland, the 80 Years' War fired up again. And, as we are all aware, that coincided with the 30 Years' War and the English Civil Wars. And all of that very nearly halted American immigration entirely, for a generation. Oh, you're a commoner with dreams of moving to America and making good. Yeah, that's cute, but here's a pike. Go kill Catholics. There were larger concerns than colonization. Now, during this period of continental warfare, there was some action along the English and Dutch border in America, but it was really a low-level provincial struggle. But there were pirates operating out of New England here in the 1640s. The most notable was Thomas Cromwell. Now, Thomas was, as far as we know, no relation of any significance to Oliver Cromwell. He was a privateer from Boston who occasionally diverged into piracy. Cromwell received his commission from the Earl of Warwick, that pirate patron-in-chief. But it wasn't to raid the Dutch. The English and the Dutch were not yet at war. Instead, he was to raid the Spanish, and that meant sailing in the West Indies. He very likely sailed alongside other pirates like Samuel Axe. At least the timing works out, and there were several very large raids that happened around that time. But even though he was from Boston, the piracy didn't take place in New England. However, he does hold a certain place in the New England pirate mythology, mainly because when he returned home after his West Indian voyage was over, he brought the governor of Massachusetts, John Winthrop the Elder, a very impressive gift. He brought him a sedan chair, one of those litters on which obscenely wealthy people are carried around by 2 or 4 slaves. But this sedan chair was draped in silk and encrusted with gold and pearls and jewels. Now, John Winthrop was a Puritan, and a famous Puritan. He never rode in his chair that we know of. Think how that would look to all of his ascetic friends and colleagues, but he was reportedly very fond of the chair, kept it around to look at. I presume he kept it around to, remind him of the sinful opulence of all of those dirty Catholics. But even though there were some other pirates operating out of New England during this period, they were some of those that were capturing, fur and fish and nothing all that exciting. The real money during this period was privateering in Europe. There were ships operating in the North Sea and the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel, even a few in the Baltic. All of those were fertile grounds for any mercenary naval outfits that were looking to make a quick buck. And some of those privateers, especially the French among them, would go on to be among the first buccaneers. But there were others who had fewer scruples operating around this time, that earned their bones down to the south. This was one of the heydays of the Barbary pirates. Barbary piracy is something of a perennial phenomenon. It pops up every few generations. In fact, I'm listening to Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and while he does his circuit geographically around the empire, once he gets to North Africa, he focuses on the Barbary pirates that people in his day faced, the same Barbary pirates that Thomas Jefferson would have to deal with. But here in the 1600s, we're talking about the second wave of the Salih rovers out of Morocco. In some ways, those Salih rovers are really the ideological precursors to the Golden Age pirates. More so in some ways than even the privateers. But they were less democratic rebels and more anarchic outlaws. They didn't care for race or religion or creed or nationality. They were bereft of any kind of loyalty whatsoever. They flouted international laws and norms and attacked anyone with a haul worth taking. And that nihilism, when blended with the ideals of the Brethren of the Coast, will go on to create the pirates that we think of when we talk about pirates. So that's all terribly exciting. But back in New England, there wasn't a whole lot happening. There were some interesting colonial developments, but as far as piracy is concerned, things were pretty slow. But then, the 30 Years' War ended, and everything changed immediately. The settlement between Spain and the Netherlands allowed the Dutch unfettered trade worldwide, even in ports that belonged to Spain. And as I said, they had been building the infrastructure for 30 years that once they were allowed to trade legally anywhere they cared to, they were immediately miles ahead of everyone else. I mean, even Spain and Portugal, who had the greatest empires the world had ever known, even they lagged behind the Dutch. England, despite all of her amazing fleets, was way in back. And France was, well, I don't know what France was doing at this point in terms of maritime trade. I think they were busy, developing dressage. But Cromwell and the English Commonwealth weren't about to take this state of affairs lying down. Now, there are some personal and political tensions between Cromwell and William of Orange, William the Second Prince of Orange, that are often highlighted, but really, if we're being honest, war is always about money and resources. And sure, there are theological questions at the center of all of these conflicts, but really, it was about who controlled the wealth. So, Cromwell promulgated the very first official Navigation Act. This Navigation Act was a singularly mercantilist approach to colonial trade. It forbade any Englishmen in the colonies or at home from trading with foreign merchants, except in a very few key exceptions. It was intended to bolster the English East India Company and the Levant Company and the New England Company, but of course that's not how the real world works. That's not how markets work. In reality, the Navigation Act left the English in the colonies with three potential options. First, they could obey the law and go broke, because the English just weren't equipped to compete with the Dutch in trade, at least not at this point. Second, they could ignore the act, which is what most of them did. Nearly everyone was taking part in a bit of smuggling or black market trade. Or three, they could obey the law and succeed by engaging in warfare, privateering, and piracy. This was an option that, at the very beginning, only a very few chose, but, as I think Cromwell probably intended, as time went on, more and more chose that third option. See, as far as what he was going to personally invest his money and time in, Cromwell had more of a stake in his Western design. That's his West Indian adventure. Jamaica and the Morgan family, we know that story. Whether he intended it or not, the Navigation Acts led to, well, I don't want to get too bogged down in colonial history. Actually, I do. I could go on about it for hours, but I'm not going to. And I also don't want to spend a lot of time on the First Anglo-Dutch War. We've talked about that before, and really, New England is only a sideshow of that war. But I will say that New Netherland, in the wake of the Navigation Act, was a particular threat to New England, and not because it was cutting the English out of trade. It was quite the opposite, in fact. New Netherland had a free market, very capitalist approach to trade. See, it was a Dutch colony, but it also wasn't. New Netherland was property of the Dutch West India Company, and as such it was home to a large, multinational coalition of merchants. Now, there were mostly Dutch, but there were also Danish and Norwegian and Swedish and German. No Frenchmen, though, and certainly no Spaniards. No Catholics allowed. And, due to the proximity of New Netherland and New England, there were a lot of English people, more than anyone else besides the Dutch. Largely because in the Dutch colony, they were allowed to do business that, due to the Navigation Act, they normally would not be. One of these Englishmen, a New Englander who transferred over to New Netherland, was a man named John Underhill. Now, he was born in England, but as a boy his family fled to the Netherlands. His father got caught up in a coup d'etat against the Queen. and in the Netherlands he joined the Prince of Orange's army. The Dutch trained John Underhill as a soldier, and he wound up marrying a Dutch woman. Now, due to all of that, you might consider John Underhill a loyal Dutchman, but he wasn't. He lived in a community of Puritan exiles in Amsterdam. That community in Amsterdam was the same that gave refuge to the Pilgrims several years earlier. In fact, John Underhill personally knew a bunch of the Mayflower Pilgrims, and that may have informed his decision, or maybe even opened the door for his immigration to Boston. Although it had just as much to do with the Earl of Warwick hiring him as the commander of their militia. John Underhill has been maybe not as prominent as the Earl of Warwick, but nearly as ubiquitous in this story. It's really a crime we haven't mentioned him yet. Underhill outfitted and trained the Boston militia. He oversaw the construction of their fort on Castle Island. He served under John Winthrop the Younger and led the construction of the fort at Saybrook. And then, when the Pequot War broke out, John Underhill led the forces of New England. He literally wrote the book on the Pequot War. It was a contemporary account of his own experience. It's not exactly Caesar's War Diaries, but it's a must-read for any colonial history aficionados. However, his next work, News from America, was even more important. It's one of the most important books in existence for those who study colonial history. And, do you remember Roger Williams, that abolitionist, freedom of religion-loving, separation of church and state-arguing radical that founded the Providence plantations? Well, it was John Underhill that was ordered to arrest him. However, Underhill grew dissatisfied with Boston and John Winthrop the Elder and all of those Puritan purity tests. So he left his home in Massachusetts. For a time, John Underhill moved to New Hampshire, and then moved on to New Haven, but finally settled down in New Netherland. He led the Dutch militia there and led yet another war against the neighboring Indian peoples. But then John Underhill was appointed by the governor of New Netherland, Pieter Stuyvesant, to a post leading the militia in Flushing. But Stuyvesant turned out to be a difficult master to serve. John Underhill was even less satisfied there than he had been in Boston. John Underhill declared, quote, "We wish to stay at the inn. Our business is our own." Yeah, that's just a bit of Lord of the Rings humor for you. What he really said, on behalf of all of the non-Dutch Europeans and the Quakers living in New Netherland, was, quote, "We declare that it is right and proper to defend ourselves and our rights, which belong to a free people." And he continued, quote, "This great autocracy and tyranny is too grievous for any brave Englishman and good Christian any longer to tolerate. Accept and submit ye, then, to the Parliament of England." End quote. John Underhill collected a commission from the Providence Council and led a small fleet against New Amsterdam. His old boss, though, Stuyvesant, was prepared for him. He ordered a wall constructed all the way across Manhattan Island, the current location of Wall Street. And he manned that wall with cannons and muskets and lots of men, so many that John Underhill was unable to attack New Amsterdam proper. Instead, he attacked a nearby settlement, took his winnings, and went home. Now, this act of aggression was done on behalf of the Rhode Island Council, but Stuyvesant went above their head and brought a suit against Underhill with the Council of New England. Stuyvesant, surprisingly, really won that suit. The action was deemed an act of piracy against the Dutch. However, John Underhill got immensely lucky here. Before a sentence could even be passed, the First Anglo-Dutch War broke out. Now, John Underhill wasn't responsible for the First Anglo-Dutch War, just as Francis Drake wasn't responsible for the Anglo-Spanish War, but both of them played a role in the tensions between England and her enemies. The First Anglo-Dutch War, though, was an incredibly stupid war, but an interesting war, especially in the field of maritime warfare. These were two of the world's largest navies duking it out on every front possible. But it's of interest to us today because of the many New England privateers that rose to prominence during the war. It was during this conflict that the Earl of Warwick really earned his reputation as a pirate broker-in-chief. Now, there aren't any famous names to throw around here. Not that we'd be interested in here. Sure, there were earls and dukes and lord admirals performing great deeds of valor on the sea, but as far as pirates are concerned, pirates whose names we might already know, there aren't any. L'Ollonais and Roque Basiliano, Pierre Le Picard, they would all earn their bones in the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Even Morgan probably had no role in this conflict. But considering how little we know about the early lives of so many of the pirates, some of them could have served as privateers in this conflict. Not captains, not masters of their own ships, but crewmen, working for others, and privateers were notoriously poor at keeping a crew manifest. When John Coxon and Peter Harris and William Dampier were engaged on the Pacific adventure, some of the old sea dogs involved there may have begun their careers in this conflict. And since after the 30 Years' War ended, so many navies sailed down to the Mediterranean to deal with the Barbary problem, some of the privateers involved in this conflict may have been themselves former Barbary pirates. As I said, we don't know any of their names. It's all speculation, but it's fun speculation. Even for the privateers active off the coast of New England, it's a scarce history. Any privateer actions usually had to be contested in a court of law to pop up on the historical radar. But that's actually helpful for us. It helps us sift through the privateer actions and find the real piracy. For example, the case of Captain Kimpo Sebata versus John Hull, Robert Hull, and Edward Hull, pirate. Before we get to that case, though, let's talk for a moment about silver. The common currency in English America was, well, tobacco, really, but when we're talking about coinage, it was the Spanish piece of 8. Now let's say, hypothetically, for the sake of argument, understand, that your colony had a noble patron. Let's throw a name out there, just a random example of a potential noble patron, say the Earl of Warwick. Now, let's assume that that random noble patron happened to be an ardent anti-Spanish Puritan, that handed out letters of marque like candy. Were that the case, hypothetically, it's entirely possible that your colony, hundreds of leagues away from any Spanish settlement, would be awash in Spanish silver. Much more Spanish silver than any English colony could have acquired through legal means. Enough that it would look suspicious should any authority figure poke their nose in. Now, I'm not saying any of this is the case. I don't want to sully anybody's memory, but were you in that hypothetical situation, what would you do with all that Spanish silver? Well, I'm sure it's strictly coincidental that in 1652, the Massachusetts Bay Colony established a mint at Boston, a silver mint in Massachusetts. Coining, we can only assume, that wealth of silver from the famed New England silver mines. And just in case my extremely sarcastic tone isn't making it clear, and you're not a historical geologist, there are no silver mines in Massachusetts. In New England in general, there are none. However, that absolutely necessary mint was overseen by a mint master named John Hull. Mark G. Hanna writes in his book Pirate Nests and the Rise of the British Empire, quote, "The role of silversmith in early America, as in medieval Europe, was complex, combining artisanship with the roles of banker, lender, hoarder, and smuggler. In the colonies, silversmiths were highly respected and powerful men." End quote. But regardless of their location, silversmiths, much like millers traditionally, or used car salesmen, they were never quite trusted. Partly that was jealousy. Partly it was a legitimate concern that those silversmiths just might be debasing the silver itself for their own personal gain. But John Hull was not taking part in any of that activity. He made excellent silver. Well, let me walk that back a bit. He did not make excellent silver. What he did, and what he was very good at, was taking Spanish silver, coined in Mexico or Peru, melt it down, and imprint his own stamp on it. John Hull created what's called the pine tree shilling, due to the pine tree he used as his imprint. It was the first New England coinage. And if you ever happen across a pine tree shilling on maybe a hike in Massachusetts, I want you to understand they're essentially worthless. You should just, send that on to me for historical purposes. Let's not sugarcoat it here. That mint in Boston was intended strictly to launder Spanish money. Its very existence was due to the piracy, the privateering emanating from New England, and it drew in even more and more pirates seeking letters of marque. The war only heightened those issues. The deal for these privateers was simple. We give you a letter of marque. You go out hunting, and you bring us back whatever silver you find. Make sure it's a good amount, mind, or don't bother, but when you do, you get to keep whatever else was on board. It was all very profitable. The Hull family, those three brothers, are notable in all of this because they owned the mint and because of that court case. In addition to the mint they owned, John and Robert Hull also owned the bark Swallow. Their younger brother, Edward, was the captain of Swallow, and from that ship he captured a number of Dutch vessels. But it actually wasn't a haul of silver that brought him to trial. It was a more mundane prize, but the owner of that ship, Kimpo Saibata, was not a fool. He knew what was going on in Boston. He knew that the Swallow, the ship that had captured one of his, was paid for with pirated silver, with those pine tree shillings made by the very men who owned the ship that captured his goods. This entire operation was pure piracy, open and shut, plain and simple. But there is a rub. Over the last few weeks, I've been looking at the most important locations in North America in relation to piracy. Boston, New York is going to be up there shortly, Cape Cod, the Carolina Colony, the Chesapeake Bay, St. Augustine, and when we get to it, Biloxi. There are a lot of options here. And I'm not prepared to say which is in fact the most important, but I will tell you my favorite. Newport, Rhode Island. Edward Hull did not have a commission. He did not carry a letter of marque, but he sailed out of Newport. So Kimpo Saibata brought suit against Hull in Rhode Island, which really Newport and Providence were one singular political entity at this point, Rhode Island proper. But a full month after Edward Hull had captured his prizes on board the Swallow, the Council of Rhode Island gave him a letter of marque. A letter of marque that was post-dated to include the capture of those Dutch vessels. And that's totally illegitimate, even illegal, but that didn't matter to the people of Newport. And they observed the proprieties, they held a trial for Edward Hull, and we actually know the names of all the magistrates and the jurors there who were upstanding members of the community. And that court, in the suit against Edward Hull and his Mintmaster brothers, who were obviously guilty, found all of them not guilty. This was the most high profile of these sorts of cases, largely because of the prominence of the Hull family, but they were happening all the time. This case created waves back in England, but it was a regular affair. And we shouldn't pretend that the Dutch didn't have pirates of their own. They absolutely did. Along with England and France, they were one of the big three pirate powers, but England, and especially New England, were just so blatant about the whole thing. It was almost a threat, a dare to their enemies. What are you going to do about it? That's a state that was very profitable in money and territory, and in the end, in the war aims of England. But it couldn't last. Upon the end of the First Anglo-Dutch War, England sent overseers to Boston and to Newport to rein in their piratical depredations. This was non-negotiable. So the Council of New England promulgated a decree. It read, quote, "The court, observing the wicked and unrighteous practices of evil men to increase, some seizing of ships, catches, etc. with their goods, and others by rising up against their commanders, officers, and employers, seizing their vessels and goods at sea, exposing their persons to hazard, for the prevention thereof, and that due witness may be borne against such bold and notorious transgressions, this court doeth order, and be it hereby ordered and enacted, that what person or persons soever shall piratically or feloniously seize any vessel, whether in the harbor or on the seas, or shall rise up in rebellion against the master, officers, merchant, or owners of any ship, and despoil or dispossess them thereof, every such offender together with their accomplices shall be apprehended and shall be put to death." End quote. What I love about that, and something that we're going to be looking at in more depth next time, is that it wasn't really the piracy of foreign shipping that concerned the Council of New England. Sure, they had to put a stop to it, but they'd already put a stop to any privateering actions. What concerned them more than anything were those crewmen rising up against the captains and officers and merchants and owners. Now, naturally, there were conditions in this decree. For example, any person who may or may not have been involved in some of those piratical depredations were allowed to come forward whenever they entered port to rat out the rest of the crew. If they chose to do so, they would earn themselves immunity and, presumably, not too many questions asked about the contents of their sea chest. And some did take that option. Their fellow crewmen were arrested and put to death. And some of those who did snitch may have been kidnapped. They might have been forced to work a pirate crew against their will. And I can feel sympathy for them. They didn't want to be there in the first place. But that really didn't matter. Because the Council of Massachusetts did not have a witness protection agency. And pirates don't respect borders. Any person who came forward to inform on their crew, should rumor of that reach the ears of pirates, did not have long to live. And that provision really did the lion's share of the work. Some pirates who didn't want to be there in the first place came forward and got their entire crew killed. Others who saw that the end was approaching for these pirates came forward and got their crew killed. The motivation doesn't really matter. The effect of this was a destruction of any trust that existed among the pirates. This small but fierce burst of post-Anglo-Dutch War piracy ended as ignominiously as it began. We left off last time with the end of the First Anglo-Dutch War and New England's response to the scourge of piracy in her waters. This is a pattern we've seen time and time again. Empower an army of privateers, accomplish your war aims, and then tell everyone to go home. Here you go, here's adventure, freedom, money, booze, women, men. Here's a taste of independence. Here's everything that the world has to offer on a platter. But now, go home. Go back to fishing or farming or working for a wage. This was a problem in every nation. Less for Spain, although it did happen, but it was particularly notable for the English. However, it wasn't an unexpected phenomenon. Let's look way back to the 14th century, and the 100 Years' War. Get that picture in your head, it's the High Middle Ages. There are noble knights in gleaming plate mail, and their young squires bearing their heraldry, and of course, lady loves holding tight to their favors. There's courtly love in Arthurian legend. That's the myth. Of course, the reality was in stark contrast. That was when the Black Death exploded. But even on a societal level, it was not that magical. Early on in the 100 Years' War, the English won a staggering victory. Their yeoman longbowmen just mowed down the ranks of noble French chevaliers. It was a really embarrassing victory for the French. Their king was captured on the battlefield. But once that battle was over, everyone agreed to a ceasefire. Modern military strategists will actually point to this decision by the English not to harry the enemy as a reason that the war and the suffering went on for so long. However, while they were discussing the formal treaty, there were still hundreds of English knights left on French soil. It was kind of English soil at that point, but it was in France. The yeomen, though, the archers, the foot soldiers, they went home, and the noblemen went home. But the lower gentry, those equestrian knights who didn't have any substantial land holdings but a decent amount of money and a horse and armor, well, they stayed in France. They formed what were called the companies, mercenary companies, and they had this idea that they would be kind of like Robin Hoods. They would ride around and right wrongs and sing love songs and engage in feats of daring do, and of course, romance fair maidens. But the reality of the companies really puts the pirates to shame. Villages were burned to the ground. Towns were captured and defiled. One company specialized in seizing and then ransoming castles back to their French lords, and that company did so well they all retired. The number of men killed is shocking, and the number of women that were raped beggars belief. Those stories are truly horrifying. The French at the bargaining table with the English were furious, and they demanded that these companies be stopped before any deal could be reached. The English king, ever gracious, agreed to their demands. He declared to those English companies, "Hey guys, cut it out. Come on, stop it." And then, when the roving bands just ignored him, as the king intended, he turned around to the Frenchmen at the bargaining table and said, "Well, there's no stopping them. You'd better come to an agreement." And then when the French came up with an offer, the English king rejected it out of hand. He demanded double. And the French capitulated. They gave him double. They gave England huge parts of France. Now, partly that's because their king was in English custody, but there were more pressing matters. Those companies of roving Englishmen were causing such devastation on a daily basis that the people were on the verge of revolt. Imagine that your daughter is in the wolves' jaws, and the only people with the power to save her are currently quibbling over some taxation rights. What would you do to make them save her? The French nobility, due to the uprising of these peasants for a moment there, feared for their very existence. So this pattern, by the time of the pirates, was old. I really just can't believe that the English were unprepared for it by the 17th century, 300 years later. But I can believe that they weren't prepared for what happened after. The difference between the companies and the pirates is that once the war was over and their unofficial purpose had been fulfilled, the companies went home. Or, some of them went off to Germany or Italy to serve the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor, but they stopped massacring and raping all across the French countryside. The pirates, well, a lot of privateers and pirates accepted the blanket pardons that were handed out after the war was concluded. They took their winnings and they went home and they invested them. They bought land or opened a business. But the pirates didn't. The men in those companies were lower gentry. They had a certain amount of chivalric nobility. But the pirates were less respectable. They were less industrious than the proper privateers. They didn't go home and invest their winnings. They'd already spent them on women and rum and guns. So what happens when their captain announces, "Well, boys, we won the war. Time to go home"? The pirates, the real honest-to-God pirates, well, they killed their captains and their officers. Maybe they threw them overboard, or, if they were really, really nice, maybe they dropped them off in the nearest port. So, after the First Anglo-Dutch War, the government of England and the councils in Massachusetts and even in Rhode Island had to announce a plan to arrest and execute anyone found guilty of piracy, which mostly worked for a while. But there were more wars coming, and the pirate menace that was set loose in those conflicts would not be so easily stopped. This is episode 161, Step Lightly. So let's pull back and do a sweep of European politics in 1660. That was the year that Charles II and the Stuart dynasty were restored to the throne of England. Charles initially was walking into a very pleasant diplomatic situation, but there were a ton of pitfalls he didn't see coming. Immediately following the end of the First Anglo-Dutch War, the English Commonwealth got involved with another war with Spain. But when Charles was restored, there was a moment where it looked like everything would work out perfectly. Charles was on very good terms with the King of France, Louis XIV, thanks to the marriage alliances and, Louis having grown up with Charles at his court. And the fact that, the conjecture that the Stuarts were secretly Catholic. Even just the rumor of that, as well as replacing those Puritan radicals, soothed over a lot of the Anglo-Spanish relations. Once the Stuarts were back on the throne, Philip III, the King of Spain, agreed to end the war. Which brings us around to the Netherlands. William III was the Prince of Orange in the Netherlands. Conveniently, he was William III, Prince of Orange, and would go on to become William III, King of England. This never happens in history. James I of England is really supposed to be James I of England and James VI of Scotland, and someone like Charles V or really any of the Holy Roman Emperors have so many titles and so many numbers it's impossible to keep track of, so just let me relish this moment with William III. Currently, though, he was not the stadholder of the Netherlands as his father and his grandfather had been. He was still stadholder in the provinces in which his family held power, but he had no influence officially or politically over the other provinces. About a decade earlier, in the early 1650s, the Netherlands had just done away with that stadholder of the Netherlands position. Instead, the highest-ranking families from all of the United Provinces convened a States General, and that served as an executive body for the Dutch Empire. That shift toward a more republican form of governance secured most of the power in the Netherlands in the hands of the Hollanders, mainly in people from Amsterdam. That shift and that power was in the hands of mostly two men. The first was Johan de Witt. We've mentioned him before. He was a powerful advocate for a republican movement away from the Orangists. And he had a lot of liberal ideals. Many, in fact, would be picked up by the American founding fathers. But he was no George Washington. Sure, he proposed a democracy, but only a democracy in which he stood at the very top. The other prominent Dutch Republican, we might call him De Witt's number 2, was named Cornelius de Graeff. He was largely responsible for the positive relations between the Dutch and English following the Restoration. He organized what's called the Gift, a large donation of Italian Renaissance artwork from the Dutch to the English. He also played a central role in organizing the marriage between Charles's niece and William III. The de Graeff family, beyond Cornelius, was a powerful and influential family in Dutch politics, going back generations. So, Was Cornelius de Graeff in any way related to Lauro de Graaf? Their names are spelled differently, but in English writings of the time that doesn't mean much. The answer is no. There's no evidence there. I will say, though, that Lauro de Graaf was probably of mixed race, and therefore would not have been in line to inherit any lands or titles. However, he married well for a pirate twice, and he was a suspiciously well-off landowner for a mere pirate. Now, if this were a colonial history, 1660 is where we would shift our focus from New England back to Chesapeake Bay. See, Virginia and Maryland were staunch defenders of royal power during and even after the Civil Wars. Cromwell was never able to root the Royalists out of Chesapeake Bay. They were too well off and paid too many taxes, but he did significantly favor New England and Jamaica. But now that Charles II was in power, all the favor shifted back to the Royalist stronghold in Virginia and Maryland. Much like Virginia, Massachusetts was too wealthy. They paid too many taxes. The king was not going to upset that apple cart. But they were put on the back burner. And it's around that time that we see this little uptick in piratical actions out of Massachusetts. Nothing too severe, not the sort of thing that would invite a visit from the Navy, but the targets that the pirates chose were usually Royalist vessels. And somehow the pirates were just too darned elusive for these Massachusetts men to catch. This is where New England, and I would even argue America, really began to lean into this tactic. Not open revolt, not rebellion, just the occasional reminder that out here in the wilds of America, His Majesty's ships could so easily come to harm, or just up and disappear. Maybe, considering that fact, the crown should step lightly. However, most of that New England piracy is poorly documented. The English were much more focused on the dastardly exploits of the scurrilous Dutch pirates. And we shouldn't brush that aside. The Dutch were very good at the business of capturing ships on the high seas. Just look at Lauro de Graaf. But this plague of Dutch piracy smells off to me. These pirates seem to have been doing the bidding of the West India Company and the States General of the Netherlands. The opposite of piracy. See, all that goodwill that King Charles II received upon his restoration fell apart amazingly quickly. All of those rulers and prominent names that we mentioned earlier began to squabble, and they began to point fingers, and King Charles was in the middle of all of it. Even the marriage between Orange and Stuart, a marriage that was supposed to secure an alliance, well, even that caused tensions. There's an argument to be made that while they were at the brink of war, those tensions pushed them over. The Second Anglo-Dutch War was a big event in New England. The conflicts, the border disputes between New Hampshire and Connecticut and New Netherland, well, they reached a fevered pitch. It was, in fact, the English capture of New Amsterdam that forced Pieter Stuyvesant to capitulate. He handed New Amsterdam over to English forces, and it was that capitulation and the prize that the English would christen New York that convinced England to sit down at the bargaining table. The Dutch won the war, but the English gained New York. The Second Anglo-Dutch War is also hugely consequential to our overarching narrative. A ton of pirates were made in privateer engagements between 1665 and 1667. However, those were almost exclusively West Indian pirates, so we're going to blow right by all of it. If you look out your porthole, you'll see the war ending and a wave of buccaneers arriving in the West Indies. There's Tortuga, and Francois l'Olonnais and Pierre Le Picard, Roque Brasiliano, Henry Morgan, Port Royal, the whole Brethren of the Coast saga, raiding up and down the Spanish Main, attacking Campeche and Maracaibo, and, in 1671, the city of Panama. Now, by that point, in 1671, the European cast of characters hadn't changed very much. Charles II was still King of England. Louis XIV, still King of France. Spain had a new king, but he was not mentally or physically capable of doing the job, so his mother and his advisors continued to actually do the business of ruling. And in the Netherlands, Johan de Witt and the Republican faction was still in power, but that wasn't going to last very long. The problem with the Republicans, de Witt and de Graaf especially, was their laser focus on commercial pursuits that had made the Netherlands very wealthy, but they focused on that to the detriment of everything else, including Dutch military power. The year after Henry Morgan sacked Panama, everyone invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch call 1672 the Rampjaar, or the disaster year. They got just pummeled by a joint Anglo-French invasion. They had maybe the most powerful navy in the world, even including the Spanish and the English. However, armies still won wars, and the Dutch had virtually no land power. However, that was not an accident. That was actually a calculated move on the part of de Witt. Like seemingly every major European war in history, the pre-war calculations all seemed to hinge around the English question. What are the English going to do? Are they going to side with France or fight against her? Or maybe they'll just sit this whole thing out. Well, Johan de Witt genuinely believed that the English would not stand for yet another war against their Protestant brethren. And his reading of the anti-Catholic sentiment in England was spot on. He really had the pulse of the English people, but he didn't factor in Charles II. His predictions would come true, of course, but only 6 years later. 6 years after the outbreak of the war and 6 years after his own death. This was the war that threw all the old alliances into disarray. Not only did England switch sides to fight alongside the Spanish, the Dutch were fighting alongside their former imperial overlords. Remember, the conflict that erupted here in 1672 wasn't just another Anglo-Dutch war. It was the Franco-Dutch War. It was the first opportunity for everyone in Europe to let off some of the steam that had been building since Westphalia. Now, we've covered this war in more depth than any of the other wars on this show, as well as the pirates that were involved, but we should pause here. This was the war in which all the latter-day buccaneers earned their stripes. John Coxon, Bartholomew Sharp, John Cook, Peter Harris, Edward Davis, the other Peter Harris, Michael André-Zoon, Lauro de Graaf, Nicholas von Horn, William Dampier, Basil Ringrose, everyone that was involved in either the first or second Pacific adventure and the drama surrounding Saint-Domingue. The only pirates who didn't begin their careers in the Third Anglo-Dutch War were the old sea dogs that tagged along like Charles Swan, or some of the younger sort who got their start after the war, pirates like George Dew. This post-Third Anglo-Dutch War era is really the bridge between the Brethren of the Coast and the Pirates of the Round. It's also when the North American colonies really come into their own as pirate bases and pirate havens and pirate hunters. And they did so, perhaps surprisingly, with royal writ. Let's turn back for a moment to Chesapeake Bay. The colonies of Virginia and Maryland were in bad shape. Virginia especially had been ravaged by Dutch raids in the first two Anglo-Dutch wars, and then they were hit by a successive wave of hurricanes and floods, and finally, a winter that killed off more than half of their livestock. All of that was bad enough, but to really top it all off, Massachusetts Bay was dominating trade in North America. Now, Virginia was still profitable, and the wealthy landowners were making a lot of money, due mostly to the trade in tobacco. But that trade was shipped back to England in large convoys, twice yearly, kind of like the Spanish Plate Fleet. And thanks to the Navigation Act and, the realities of wind and tide, there were very few ships that came to call at Jamestown. Now that Massachusetts Bay was such a center of trade, that's where everyone was going. So getting supplies shipped into Virginia was becoming harder and harder. And when the war broke out in 1672, the Lords of Trade and Plantations ordered the governor of Virginia to prepare for war. But Virginia was not prepared. The letter that their governor wrote back is a tale of woe and of a colony on the brink of collapse. Their forts were in total disrepair. The brickmakers there in Virginia could not make brick out of the Virginia soil. Their food stores were low, and beyond that, storing food in Virginia, in the hot, humid American South before the advent of refrigeration, was virtually impossible. The guns that Virginia had were old. They had no ammunition. Perhaps most distressing, though, was the ratio of freemen to the slaves and indentured servants. The freemen were a tiny minority there in Virginia, and they certainly weren't going to put guns in the hands of their labor force. They would rise up and kill them all. And if the governor ordered all of the free men to assemble in Jamestown to form a militia, they would have to turn their backs on the slaves and indentured servants, who would inevitably rise up and kill them all. The governor ended the letter by saying that the legislature, against his wishes, had just drafted up plans to abandon the plantations and flee into the mountains. And their ships? What ships? All of the good shipyards and the shipwrights were up in New England. The governor begged them for supplies and men and guns and ammunition. Now, this was the sort of thing that colonial governors did all the time. Oh, it's so terrible here. You've got to send us more food, more money, more guns, more men. And usually they were exaggerating. Sometimes they were outright defrauding the home country. So the Lords of Trade and Plantations replied, no. However, there were at this point 2 ships en route to escort the tobacco crop across the Atlantic. When they arrived, they saw that the governor was not exaggerating. He wasn't lying. The state of Virginia's defenses were just as bad as he had claimed. They documented everything they saw, but then they prepared to depart. However, as they did so, a Dutch fleet arrived at Jamestown. This was almost a perennial affair. The English kept getting involved in fights with the Dutch, and the Dutch kept sending ships to Jamestown, and they always won. Now, those 2 English men of war put up a good fight. The Dutch fleets certainly weren't expecting them. It was a pretty intense day-long sea battle. But even with those 2 men of war, the numbers just weren't in England's favor. The report that the governor and the captains of those 2 men of war wrote called the Dutch pirates. But they weren't. Some of them were privateers, but just enough to flesh out the fleet that was owned by the West India Company. And we can be pretty sure of their intentions here. After the battle was over, after the Dutch had captured hundreds of tons of tobacco, another English ship arrived on the scene. She was a small English ketch that was filled with hogsheads of tobacco. The Dutch seized his ship and questioned the captain. But the captain swore to God that none of this tobacco was intended for or owned by the English crown. He was going to tag along with the fleet across the Atlantic, obviously, but all of this, his ship, his crop, everything was privately owned, and he was going to sell it to private merchants back in England. And the Dutch fleet let him go. They weren't after a private citizen's property. They weren't at war with the merchants. They were at war with the crown, and they only wanted crown property. To me, that says more than anything else, these men were not pirates. The Dutch, as we will see, were not employing pirates. This raid was a huge embarrassment for England. The governor was recalled to England to defend his actions. However, upon arrival, he died. There was some suggestion it may have been suicide, but he was old and already in poor health, a heavy smoker, and it's more likely that the stress added to those complications killed him. But the captains that had fought that battle outside Jamestown confirmed what the governor had said in his letter. They were not prepared to defend themselves. They were falling apart. England, though, didn't have the resources to help them out. They just started a war with their next-door neighbors. They didn't have the men or the guns or the ships or the food. Instead, they did something that Charles II rarely did. They granted the lieutenant governor, now acting governor of Virginia, the power to grant letters of marque. As this was a rare event, many of the New England men who were old hands at fighting on the sea sailed down to Virginia to collect their letters of marque. It was an economic opportunity they could not turn down. And for the Chesapeake, this was great news. They had a private mercenary navy sailing out of the Chesapeake, clearing their waters of any enemy ships. However, that left New England in a tricky situation. All of their best sailors, their own private mercenary navy, had just sailed down south, and their own waters were now open season for any Dutchman that wanted to come in, maybe to reclaim New Netherland. When they asked for permission to dispense letters of marque, they were told no, because Charles II didn't care what happened to New England, so they wrote another letter. A letter that informed the lords of trade and plantations that they were going to issue letters of marque. It was necessary to their survival and the profits and the taxes that went back to England, and beyond that, what was England going to do about it? They'd just started a war, remember? They didn't have the ships to send across the sea, and if they did, the New English would have their own private navy. It was here that the names that we are going to know began to pop up in New England history. Some of them, due to the Dutch policy toward pirates, were themselves Dutchmen. Now, La Rode Graaf and Nicholas von Horn, Michael Andrezun, they were all Dutch, but they were all sailing for France, down south. However, one buccaneer that they would sail alongside, someone that they would come to know quite well and that we've met before, was at this point living in New England. Jan Willems, alias Yankee Williams, was a native-born Dutchman. He might have lived in New Netherland for a time, or he may have come to America here for this privateering opportunity. Either way, the first record that we have of Jan Willems comes from his association with another buccaneer that we know, an Englishman, sailing out of Jamestown, Rhode Island. Thomas Paine, though born in England, was already living in America when the war broke out. He and Jan Willems and their whole little cohort started their privateering career right here. And now that we're here with this plucky band of pirates at the outbreak of the Third Anglo-Dutch War, right as the explosion of piracy in New England is about to erupt onto the world, well, that's where we're going to leave it for today. You might have noticed that our coverage of North American piracy shifted gears the last couple of weeks. We started out really zoomed in, looking at stories of their fledgling colonies and the pirates there in close detail. And then we switched to kind of a macro view. I had this outline for our coverage of North American piracy. And while there are a lot of stories there, as I said last time, they're just not that exciting. I need blood in my stories, and not, sad blood like the Indian massacres. I need some fun blood. I need thunder on the high seas, and there just isn't much of that, at least not in the record. Until, that is, the period that we're going to talk about next time. The buccaneers in North America in the 1670s and the 1680s. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who has helped to support the show. All of our patrons on Patreon, those of you who have donated through the website, everyone who has left us ratings or reviews, and those of you who have recommended this show online or to your friends and family in real life. All of you make this show possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you can find them at brillig.com.au. That's BRILLIG.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, these days, most importantly, thank you, stay safe, and be well.